Hey folks, welcome to the September 14th, 2018 edition of Roland Martin Unfiltered. No, I am not in the nation's capital. I am here in the city of Angels, Los Angeles, where I will be giving a speech tonight to a local union here. So looking forward to it. But over the next hour, we've got a fantastic show lined up for you today. Of course, Congressional Black Caucus Foundation ALC 2018 is still going on in D.C. I'll be back there tomorrow. But yesterday, there was a powerhouse panel that featured Andrew Gillum, the brother who's running for governor in Florida, Stacey Abrams, a sister running for governor in Georgia, and Ben Jealous, the brother running for governor in Maryland. It was moderated by Angela Rye. Our Roland Martin Unfiltered cameras were there. We're going to bring you a lot of that panel. You don't want to miss this. Also, what is happening when it comes to our black banks? With Case Lawal of Houston, they are expanding Unity Bank to Atlanta, and they plan to make it the largest black banking group in America. We'll show you what he has to say. Also on today's show, talk about stuck on stupid. Have y'all seen this white supremacist who tried to say the Civil War wasn't about slavery? Me, you don't want to miss that. Also, Lori Stokes, she is a television anchor out of New York. Her father is the great Louis Stokes. Well, guess what? Before he passed away, he finished his book, The Gentleman from Ohio. She has been about pushing that. He is a co-founder of the Congressional Black Caucus. We're going to have that interview for you. Plus, a Mississippi state senator went on MSNBC to defend their state flag. Oh, trust me, I have something to say about that. Folks, it's time to bring the funk. You're watching Roland Martin Unfiltered. Let's go.
He's got it. Whatever the miss, he's on it. Whatever it is, he's got the scoop, the fact, the find. And when it breaks, he's right on time and it's rolling. Best believe he's knowing. Putting it down from sports to news to politics. With entertainment just for kicks, he's rolling.
Welcome to all of you who are watching Roland Martin Unfiltered on the Facebook, YouTube, Periscope, and Twitter. Glad to have you here. Be sure to share this video with all your followers so they can get the most unapologetic view of Black America anywhere on television, radio, or on the internet. So let's go, folks. Congressional Black Caucus Foundation ALC 2018 is taking place in the nation's capital, and that was an amazing panel that took place on Thursday. Our cameras were there. It featured Ben Jealous running for governor of Maryland, Stacey Abrams running for governor of Georgia, Andrew Gillum running for governor of Florida. It was moderated by Angela Rye. Take a look.
Hey everybody! Hello! We need high energy. This is going to be such an amazing conversation. So I first want to give to you all my good friend. I've known him for 15 years. He started off in public service as a Student Government Association president at Gainesville High School, then went on to become SGA president at Florida A&M University. He's a rattler. There's some rattlers in the building. Went on to become Tallahassee City Commissioner and now serves as the Tallahassee mayor, and probably will be, I don't say almost likely, I'll say we'll go out and just go ahead and call him Governor Andrew Gillum.
Love you.
Next up, we have someone who has now become a Time cover girl. She is the face, and I think Andrew kind of rode that wave of what's happening in the South. Stacey Abrams is someone who started with the New Georgia Project, ensuring that our voices would be heard. We'll talk more about that on this panel. Senate Minority Leader in Georgia. And then she went on to start running this campaign, talking to folks all over Georgia about the importance of affordable health care and signing folks up herself. She rolls up her sleeves and works every day tirelessly for us. And just like with Andrew, we can go ahead and say, the next governor of Georgia, ladies and gentlemen, Stacey Abrams.
All right, sis.
That's her job. If you did your job, we'll hurt you.
And certainly not least, but last addition to the panel is someone who we all saw really making change happen. First, as the NAACP president, he has a long resume that's amazing, probably the most unconventional candidate up here because he hasn't served in public service. But how many of us know sometimes that's exactly what we need? Someone to change the face of things. He's running against an incumbent in Maryland, but he's run such a strong campaign, surprised a lot of folks, you all. But he learned a lot working with the NAACP. We know those chapters in our communities do so much for us every day. Ben Jealous was a big part of that. The next governor of Maryland, ladies and gentlemen, Benjamin Todd Jealous. All right, well, let's get started. I want to just start with something really simple, but I think it's an important question. And Ben, I really want to start with you because as I said in your intro, you're the most unconventional candidate. You don't come from, you know, I'm a lifelong politician, no shade. It's good. I'm glad you started at Gainesville High School, Andrew. But why politics? Why politics for you and why now?
You know, when I left the NAACP, having served as their youngest president, my blood pressure was 180. And I didn't realize I had undiagnosed sleep apnea. And I figured it out. My blood pressure now is in the 120s. And the uprisings happened in Baltimore right around that time. And I found myself in the neighborhood where my mom grew up. And I realized that I've been blessed most of my life to do the thing I was best at, which is to pull people together to get big things done. And now that I had my health under control, I needed to get back to it. And so I'm running for governor because it's time for us to finally fully fund our schools, to make sure that we all have health care and we can afford it, and to get our economy going again. And as somebody who spent the last 5 years since I left the NAACP investing in startups, I know that our state has a much more robust future, and I'm eager to see it happen sooner rather than later.
Thank you. Thank you. Stacey? What about you? Why politics? Not why now for you, but why politics? How did you get dragged into this mess?
So I grew up in Mississippi. I like to say I'm Mississippi raised and Georgia grown. In Mississippi, my parents worked full-time and yet barely stayed above the poverty line. My mom liked to call us the genteel poor. We had no money, but we watched PBS and we read books. But my parents would make sure that we spent every Saturday in service. They would take us out to volunteer at soup kitchens and homeless shelters because they would say, look, having nothing is not an excuse for doing nothing. And that ethos has driven me my entire life, in part because I was really frustrated by the fact that my parents and my 5 brothers and sisters and myself, that we were the social action force for Gulfport, Mississippi. I'm like, this is very inefficient. Shouldn't someone else be doing this? And my parents said, that's called government. Government is supposed to do more to provide access, because I personally believe poverty is immoral, it's economically inefficient, and it is solvable. And that has to be how we approach our... And so for me, politics became the only way to deliver on the promise of what good government can do. I started out as an attorney. I was then deputy city attorney for Atlanta. But what I found was that I couldn't make politicians do what I told them to. And so I became one myself. And the more I did that work, the more I realized that the job that can transform the lives of the incarcerated, the lives of the poor, those being pushed out of their communities by gentrification, those who haven't had health care in their lifetime, those who want to start a small business but can't get access to capital, all of those solutions rest in the hands of the governor of the state, and I want to be the person who delivers those solutions for Georgia.
So Andrew, I want to switch gears just a little bit, but on the same question, often when you're out stumping, you talk about pedigree. And you talk about you don't fit the pedigree or the mold, right? We know a lot of, at least the majority, white folks are a little richer when they get into politics, or they have some rich family members. We see that even in the Democratic Party. But you talk about being raised by a father who's a construction worker, a mother who's a school bus driver, and you don't come from the right pedigree. Given that, Andrew, you didn't pick a route where you would make a whole lot of money. You picked politics. Why do that?
I know, right? To be amongst this talented, amazingly talented group of nominees of our respective parties to be governors of our respective states is pretty incredible. It's pretty incredible. In fact, I don't think for a lot of us this moment and the significance of it will seep in until some time from now. But there were a lot of people who didn't think we deserved to be here. And some of that is our pedigree, and some of it is a little bit of something else. We won't talk about that. In Miami-Dade, was born in Miami. I finished high school in Gainesville, Florida, and then I came to Tallahassee, Florida to attend my version of Hillman College, known as Florida A&M University. And I was one of 5 candidates in the Democratic primary, the only non-millionaire running for the Democratic nomination.
You were the brokest one.
To put it...
The brokest. Tell them how much you spent, Andrew. Tell them how much you spent.
To put it differently, I was a broke one. In the race, we spent about $6 million to the combined spending of my opponents combined of over $90 million. And we ended up winning that race. Don't let anybody tell you. Don't let anybody tell you. Don't let anybody tell you that you got to have the most money, or come from a certain background, or attend certain schools, or grow up on the right side of the track in order to be of service to people. You don't. You got to have a heart to care with. You got to have a willingness to make a difference. And you got to have a plan to get something done for somebody other than yourself.
Amen.
And that will take you a great distance. I think what voters saw was that I was willing to engage authentically, that I didn't have much to lose, and therefore I could run as myself. I didn't have to compromise my values. I didn't have to worry about somebody being disappointed because they had no expectations of me to begin with. It just had to be me. And I just got to tell you that there's liberation in that. There's freedom in just being able to be yourself. And I think that made all the difference in the world for us in the primary. And I believe that that will be the ingredients that will get us across the top on November 6th to become the next governor of Florida.
We got a fan right here. Since Andrew said we're not talking about this, we're going to talk about this.
Oh, Lord.
I want us, in our authenticity, to talk about some of the barriers that existed even in the primary, because I think it's important that, Stacey's already laughing.
Yeah, I know what you're about to say.
I think it's important that the party, this blue wave that's supposed to happen, understands this formula. And what I mean by this is you have 3 black gubernatorial candidates who were told they could not win, who were told they didn't have enough money, who were told they didn't come from the right pedigree, who were told their daddies were whomever and so they should be next, who were told that we're going to run white Stacey over black Stacey, and so on and so forth. And so just for a moment, I know we have to unify, but in order to unify, first you got to tell the truth. So, to this very black room, I want you all to talk a little bit about what a winning formula looks like, even for statewide office, because Andrew says it, I think, best. It doesn't have to run as Republican light. Right. So can you talk a little bit about your platforms and even some of the things that the party would have said, don't stand on that. Standing on that means you'll lose, stand your ground. Other things that you all are standing on and will continue to stand on going into the general. Sorry, it was kind of a speech. It's my soapbox question now.
Sure. So I'll start. As Angela pointed out, I did not look like my opponent, although we shared the same first name. And at Netroots Nation, I made a comment in my speech. Look, I didn't have to change my hair, my skin color, or my gender to become the next governor of Georgia. And the importance of that is, look, I have natural hair. Since we're on a podcast, I am of a very rich brown hue.
I'm richer.
Speak.
It's the only thing I'm rich in. It's melanin.
No comment. Let's just go on.
I know. But you know what, Ben? We're still really black on the inside completely.
Black is a state of mind, baby.
All black everything.
I did not mean to go anywhere near this.
I know. What
Anyway.
happened? And Stacey, Ben just pulled I have black friends. That is what just happened.
Oh!
What is going on?
You know, Angela's been waiting to pull my black cards as I became president.
Put us on the rails.
Let's just be clear.
I have home training, so I'm going to get back to the subject.
I know, my bad.
So, but the reason this matters is that, you know, certainly running as a black woman in the Deep South, running for an office that no black woman has ever held, led a great deal of the traditional Democratic apparatus to assume I could not win. And then I exacerbate it by talking about my brother who is in and out of prison and has bipolar disorder and needs help and needs support from our state. I've talked about the fact that I am broke. I actually make a pretty good living, but I'm responsible for my parents, for my niece who my parents adopted when she was 5 days old, for my grandmother who lives with them, wow. And I owe the IRS $39,480. I paid a lot of it down. But I talk about it because you cannot have a conversation about how we help working families take care of themselves if you don't know what it means to be a working family.
Yes.
And so I talk ad nauseum about Medicaid expansion because one of the reasons I stepped up to take care of my parents, and I have amazing brothers and sisters, I just had the better salary. And we know that when one of us gets a job, we all get a good job. Yeah. And I was able to step up when my parents would have been forced, after Hurricane Katrina, onto Medicaid. I would not let my parents lose their health insurance. And I've become their primary source of revenue outside of, you know, the jobs that they've had. And my parents are Methodist ministers now, so they're like permanently poor. But my point being that we have to understand, especially in our communities, that our expectations have to be calibrated to having people who know what our lives are like. You cannot solve a problem you don't understand. And while we don't have to have the exact same problems, we have to acknowledge the authenticity of the challenges we face, and you have to have solutions that are actually achievable in order to solve them. But what I think both Ben and Andrew did so spectacularly in their communities and in their campaigns is not only talk about the problem and talk about the solution, but we may not have the pedigrees that they expect, but we have the credentials for solutions that no other candidates like us have ever had.
Yeah. All right, folks, welcome back to Roland Martin Unfiltered. He is part 2 of that panel Angela Rao moderated with Andrew Gillum, Ben Jealous, and Stacey Abrams.
So, Ben, to you, I would ask the same question. Some of the things that maybe the establishment didn't expect for you to have, some of the challenges you've experienced, some of the challenges you'll face going into the general, or that
the first thing the establishment tried to do is try to actually disown me from my state. And I had to just explain to them, because like, what high school did you go to? I said, well, my mom desegregated Western High School for girls. I tried to give them a clue where I was headed. And then I just had to make it plain. I said, look, I didn't have the opportunity to grow up here because my parents' marriage was against the law and it was illegal for them to return to the state. I was shipped back here every summer because this is where home is and this is where my family is. And when your family's from West Baltimore, the one thing you never do is forget who your family is or where you're from, or what your responsibility is once you've done better to make sure that everybody does better. And so And then they started asking questions. You know, they're like, well, you know, tell us about your success. I said, well, look, my mom grew up in the housing projects. I became a Rhodes Scholar. I can't explain how you get from one to the other without the unions that made sure that my grandparents had a good wage, had enough money to pay for me to go to college. And they're like, no, you're not supposed to mention unions if you're running for governor, south of the Mason-Dixon. Well, I've been a union member myself. It also helped me. And so I just said, look, I'm going to run as who I am, and if that's a little more complex than your picture of what a candidate for governor should be, so be it. Because all of us live lives that are way more complex than anybody's caricature. But I'll be clear, I am here to run for office because there's work that's undone that my family's been involved in for 80 years in Baltimore, to make sure that zip code does not determine your destiny. And as long as I have neighbors, as long as I have family members who feel like they're trapped in their zip code, I'll be doing the same work that my grandma did when she was a social worker in Maryland and helped train Barbara Mikulski, and that's serving the people of our state and helping us all find our way to a better place.
And Andrew, there was a point in your campaign where another young black man was shot in Florida, Marquise McLaughlin. And you started hammering hard on the importance of a state of emergency or emergency stay on the Stand Your Ground law and how important it would be for you to repeal it as governor. There are a number, yes. There are a number of folks in the party, people who text message me like, tell your friend this is the death knell for his campaign. You know, because you were doing something for us so that your sons could survive in the state of Florida. Talk about why that was more important to you than getting that little nudge of support from the party. Yeah,
I mean, so, and there's a common theme, I think, in all of our stories, which is we didn't run from our stories and our experiences. It informed our public policy. Exactly. Our lived experiences really informed it. And on Stand Your Ground, my position on it didn't change from when I spoke up after the death of Trayvon Martin. We spoke up resoundingly. We said that Stand Your Ground law has no place in civilized society, and we didn't make apologies for it. But when this one came around, and again, I was in a 5-way race, so it was great to have the other fields start to speak out on these issues that we've been talking about for so long. It was strength and partnership. This one struck me a little bit differently because when Trayvon Martin happened, even though I myself am a black man, obviously, I didn't have 2 sons at the time. And so it really did hit me a little bit differently. And if you don't know the fact pattern of the case, Marquise McLaughlin was driving home with his partner, Brittany, and their 3 children, 1 5-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a few-month-old. And as they would do sometimes on their way home, they pulled off into a circle, bodega, Circle 8. And Marquise got out of the car with his 5-year-old son. They pulled into a handicap spot. He got out, went inside the store, took his 5-year-old son with him, and left Brittany and the 2 babies in the car. Well, across the street from this Circle 8 is a gun shop. And there's a guy who perpetually kind of hangs out in this space and has a reputation for antagonizing people. So he decides to come over, start banging on the window where Brittany and the kids are seated, circles the car, banging, pushing on the car, cursing at Brittany in front of her children. Someone lets Marquise McLaughlin know what was going on inside. He comes out, sees the man next to his family, threatening them, and he shoves them to the ground. He then takes a few steps back as this man then reaches for a weapon, pulls it out. And in front of his 5-year-old child, his life is snuffed out. I went to the site of this location when I was in the area for a rally. Afterwards, I just wanted to go by and see what was up. And while I was standing there for probably 15 minutes, no less than 2 or 3 cars had come and pulled into this same handicapped spot where the blue paint had been kind of erased away, you could tell that this was a ritual, not necessarily judging right or wrong, that so many times people had probably done before. And that the only difference was that this guy today decided that he was going to pick a fight. And in my state where I live, the law is such that you can go antagonize, push the bear, start a fight, and then hide behind, stand your ground when somebody responds. If anybody had a right to stand their ground that day, it was Marquise McLaughlin, Brittany, and those 3 children. But the law was such that there was no penalty to be paid for that. Until we began to raise our voices in March and we stood up, and even for a short while we sat in, and the state attorney, because the sheriff said because of stand your ground he could not make an arrest, the state attorney intervened and said, I'm going to bring charges in this case. Could you imagine just for a moment the shoes had been reversed? That the man going around the corner and around the car banging on the window and yelling and screaming at a white woman in the car with 2 white children, and the husband comes out and shoves him to the ground. The black man pulls a gun and takes a shot. I'm not trying to be sensational about this. I just want to speak the truth. I just want to speak the truth. We all know that race still matters in this society, and the challenge that we have, frankly, as 3 black candidates running in majority states that are not majority black, certainly in our cases, is that we have to figure out a way to communicate these things in such a way that even the majority white population can have some empathy for it. Right. That they can understand, because I don't believe all white people are racist. I certainly don't believe the majority of the people in my state are racist. I just believe that we all have a set of certain experiences that color our perspectives. And that it's important for people of courage to be able to speak up when these moments present themselves, even at the risk of sometimes not being able to politically prevail or politically win, but to speak up because it's the right thing to do. I did it because it was the right thing to do.
Which is an exception these days too. You all are exceptional candidates in lots of ways. Since you talked about race, and not all white people are racist, facts, but y'all's opponents, except for Ben, I think maybe, they had a little problem with race. There have been some ads that have come out. Andrew, I was ready to fight, like shadow box the air. For real. Like, if you all haven't heard it, you should listen to it. In Idaho, KKK or whatever funded a robocall making him sound crazy. Like, we might even play it in the podcast, but it's like, my name's Andrew Gillum. Of your, the race against your opponent too. But the race has been injected into your races. Andrew, the first day the candidate says, tell Florida not to monkey this up. And they're like, people always say that. No, fool, they say monkey around, right? And they're like, wrong preposition. No, wrong everything, Ron DeSantis. But I think for a moment, I think it's really, really important for people to understand the distinction. Stacey, for you in particular, I want to start with you, Andrew, because you just finished. The race is neck and neck.
Yes.
And so we can say that, like, all white people aren't racist and everybody in Georgia is not racist, but the only thing that can explain why you're neck and neck with a bigot is racism and white privilege. You don't have to say those words. I said that. But let's let Stacey answer this part. Because I think it's important. Like, we're not going to ever get to move forward as a country from racism and the vestiges of slavery until we really take this head on.
So, here's how I think about it. Race is a marker. We use it to tell ourselves stories about who we are and the people we're around. Mm-hmm. We do the same with gender, and when race and gender are intersected, the stories become even more complicated on both sides of the gender conversation. I do not assume that every aspersion cast on me by my opponent is based in race. But I know that when you have a tap dancing icon in the commercial against me, that you could have picked a ballerina, you could have picked somebody doing merengue, you picked a tap dancer. And there was something implicit in what was done that either calls to what you think or calls to something you haven't examined. And part of the challenge with the conversation of race is that it imputes, as Andrew just eloquently laid out, it is imputed into so many other decisions that we make. We have conversations about race when we never use the words. And when we have policies that aren't grounded. So an example for me is, one of the things I'm pushing is for a $10 million small business financing fund. Georgia has a lot of laws on the books that allow for minority contracting. And yet 1% of the contracts go to minority firms in a lot of different ways. You have to kind of take Atlanta out of the picture. Part of the challenge there is that a lot of these minority firms can't get the contract because they can't get any capital. Well, in the Great Recession, Georgia lost more banks than any other state in the nation. The majority of those banks were community banks in low income or communities of color. And so when those banks disappeared, they didn't come back post-recession. Which means that, yes, you can qualify for an SBA loan, but if no one will write you the check, it's worth nothing. My opponent has said, well, you don't need a small business financing fund because it's not going to solve the problem, and even if it would solve the problem, you've got banks that will do that. No, not every community has a bank that will do that. And race is implicit in the conversation because if you live in the wrong zip code without a bank, your business will remain a dream because you will never get the capital you need to get it off the ground. And we know there's a direct correlation between Main Street businesses, those small businesses, not the high-tech ones, but the mechanic and the barbershop and the cafe. And if they can borrow the money to buy the shop or to buy that extra piece of equipment or to lease that next piece of land, we know that when small businesses succeed, communities succeed. And when small businesses struggle, communities struggle. If you don't understand that there's a racial element to banking in America in 2018, how can you solve the challenge of the lack of access to jobs for so many of our communities? Race is embedded in how we have to think about these things. It is not the only dimension, but it is a critical dimension that we have to confront and acknowledge because otherwise we cannot solve these problems.
You know, part of, you know, the challenge that all of us have to face in this is we have to talk about this conversation and at the same time try to hold our people. So that we can win these elections, because ultimately the goal here is to ensure that we can address the problems that you've heard discussed on this dais. And it just reminds me of the role that each of us have to play in this conversation. I will every single day out loud, but it's a line you can't cross in calling it out, because then you've called the race card, or you've pandered in some way, or you're trying to send some secret signal to somebody. Well, so far in my race, it seems my opponent and all of his friends are the only ones trying to send secret signals, but they're not so secret. They're actually pretty monkey it up, and you know, neo-Nazi phone calls, and a Republican committee woman down in Orlando sent out an email saying, or a Facebook post, whatever, Gillum is quoted as saying he's going to win so that he could have reparations for his people. I've never said, I've been elected 15 years. I've never said anything, not even resembling something like that. But this is what I know for sure. And this is why we have to be careful not to, certainly for those of us who are candidates, kind of fall into the trap. My grandmother used to put it this way: never, ever, ever wrestle with pigs because you both get dirty, but the pig likes it. So there are some of y'all will get that tomorrow, right? And for the press covering it, I'm not calling my opponent a pig. I'm simply, you know, using a figure of speech to say that when we go down into that barrel, if they're able to make our races, no pun intended, but about race, that's one we can't win. We don't have the numbers.
Well, and that's the goal. I mean, the RGA is attacking all of us, and their ads against me. Very distinguished old law professor just felt moved to write a letter to the Baltimore Sun describing as blatantly racist. And their goal is to get us to go low when they go low. But we have to go high. And the reason we have to go high is because that's the way that you lead people out of where they're stuck right now. You travel, our state's really like 4 states. We got Western Maryland, we got the Eastern Shore, we got the Baltimore region, we have the DC suburbs of the state. And when you listen to families of all colors, of every faith in each of those regions, 80-85% of their issues are the same. And we just have to understand that, race is used as a tool to divide us. My grandma's family's been in this region for like almost 400 years. She descends from Thomas Jefferson's grandmother's other grandchildren that were her slaves. And she would always remind me, she'd say, baby, before there were slave rebellions, there were colonial rebellions, and there were African slaves and Irish indentured servants rebelling together. And the first was in Gloucester, Virginia, and what sparked it was an edict from the king to the governor, the people on that dock where they rebelled, that said, in summary, and your status shall convey to your children. In other words, from the very beginning of the American experiment, we at the bottom of the pyramid of our economy were always willing to endure a lot so long as we could hope that our children might be better off. And the moment that they informed us that our children would be no better off and possibly worse, the tradition was we would rebel, and we would rebel together. Those lines of race didn't matter so much on that dock. And they don't matter so much to the people of this region now. But you got to be clear that there's a way for us to all come together and do better, and that's what our campaigns are all about.
All right, folks, that was, again, a great conversation there. We certainly appreciate you checking that out. Now, check this out. Today on Morning Joe, they had this state senator from Mississippi who is running for the United States Senate. And this is the guy who Thad Cochran beat a couple of years ago when his Tea Party leanings and his racist views were exposed. Well, on Morning Joe, Eddie Glaude of Princeton asked him about the Confederate flag. Y'all, check how the conversation went.
If you were elected to the U.S. Senate, you're supposed to represent the whole state.
Yes, sir.
Your position around the Confederate flag, your position around hip-hop as the source of gun violence, your position around Robert E. Lee. I can go on and on and on.
Please do.
How do you convince black folk in this state that you're not a danger to them?
The story that you talked about, the hip-hop connection to violence, that was a study from Berkeley. Berkeley's not exactly a conservative institution, but it did link hip-hop to violence. That's Berkeley, not me. And I was just cited that on the radio show. That's the first thing. Number two, our flag has been here an awfully long time. And in 2001, 65% of Mississippians chose to keep that flag. Now, the thing about flags, like any symbol is, they are subject to different interpretations. But if 65% of the people have voted to keep that flag, we should respect their wishes. The flag can be offensive to some. I recognize that. But almost all symbols are offensive to someone. At some point, the majority has to control that decision. This is exactly what we did. So I'm going to stand with the majority in that instance. Now, if the people of Mississippi want to start another referendum and want to change it, that's the direct democracy concept they like to push sometimes. Okay. But I'm going to stand for that flag because the people have stood for it.
So how would you speak to that 38%? Those 38% of this state, I'm going to ask them after 100 years of relying on big government to save you, where are you today? After 100 years of begging for federal government scraps, where are you today? We've been dead last for 100 years.
Look, here's the real deal here. Chris McDaniels wants to defend the Confederate flag. For him to sit there and say that, well, 65% of the people voted for it, well, then everything is okay. No, it's not okay. Folks, let's just be real clear here. Mississippi wants to remain as if it is all about the Old South. They somehow don't want to accept that the Confederacy actually lost. Just so you can understand how racist Mississippi continues to be when it comes to the flag, when it comes to the past, in the United States Senate, the senior senator from Mississippi sits at the desk of Jefferson Davis. Who was Jefferson Davis? He was the president of the Confederacy. Jefferson Davis is the guy who led the Confederacy. And guess what? The senior senator still sits at his desk. They still honor Jefferson Davis with a holiday. They fly that racist flag. If you go to Statuary Hall, when you see every state gets 2 statues, they have 2 statues of Confederates. Mississippi does not want to come into the 21st century. And the reality is, black folks and others in Mississippi should not elect to the United States Senate somebody who is willing to defend and accept that racist flag. But here's the other thing in Mississippi. Don't give me all this big government stuff. The reality is, 42+% of your entire budget comes from the federal government. Mississippi gets more money from the federal government than they get from taxes in their state. And so all these red state people who love talking about the federal government, guess what? Without the federal government, Mississippi will be broker than broke. The reality is this. It's time to end white supremacy. It is time to end what is happening all across this country, and Mississippi has no business flying that racist flag. You want to celebrate America? Fly the United States flag, because the Confederates, they lost. They lost to the North. They lost to the Union. And no one who wants to serve in the U.S. Senate should be willing to defend that racist flag. Now, folks, you know how I feel when it comes to the issue of black banks, and Unity Bank out of Houston, Texas is trying to really keep our black banks alive. They have expanded to Atlanta, and they have plans to expand to other cities across the country. Case Lawal, he, of course, is the chairman of the board of the bank out of Houston, Texas. I caught up with him at the event on Wednesday at the MLK Memorial Foundation. They had their luncheon, and so our cameras were there. Check out the interview. Case, first of all, Unity Bank, my hometown of Houston, you guys are doing some expansion.
We really are. We really are. We believe the time has come to have consolidation in African American controlled bank in the United States. We started this stuff in 2005. At that time, Roland, believe it or not, we had 47 African American controlled banks. Today, we have just 20. And if it continues like this, we may be having 15 in the next 18 months. So we feel that the time has come for us to consolidate, to be able to serve the community better, to be able to help the incubation, those in the information technology, in these social media businesses, to develop our youth with incredible talents and brains that just need the capital to be able to grow. So that's the reason we are doing what we are doing. So you've gone to Atlanta, and what are some of the cities you're looking at? We are looking right now at a greenfield in Chicago, because as you recall, Seaway National Bank closed shop last year, January. FDIC closed it. That is an incredible vacuum over there in Chicago with tremendous community support over there. And we are hoping that we're going to be in Newark, New Jersey, and New York by 2019. All right. Well, it sounds good. Unity Bank is doing great things, and we absolutely need to be thinking about, well, I keep telling everybody, 25 years from now, we're going to be a nation that's a majority of people of color. We need to be ready to assume that power. We must. We must. I do agree with you. And believe me, without capital, it's so difficult to be able to take advantage of the opportunities that are right on our doorsteps, and African Americans must be an integral part of that. We must be, and we need the banks to be very strong and very solid.
Defeat is not bitter unless you swallow it. Educator Joe Clark.
Stupid!
Folks, welcome back to Roland Martin Unfiltered. Now, every week, people say and do some absolutely stupid things all the time. Well, guess what? We're going to feature the dumbest, the stupidest, the most ignorant thing a person has said or tweeted every single week. And this week, here's this guy who was interviewed for the Trayvon Martin documentary that aired on BET and Paramount. Just listen to what this idiot had to say about the Civil War and slavery.
I completely understand that people think the Confederate flag to be a racist symbol, but the vast majority of people believe that it's a symbol of heritage. It's a symbol of our history that people think is associated with the South, and the South was fighting for slavery. That's a common misconception about what actually took place. When you study the history, that was one thing that the war was about. People don't go to war for one issue. I mean, I'm not a historian. I mean, you're putting me on the spot for something
So we got one thing that the war is about, slavery. What are two other things that the war is about?
The Confederate, in general, the war was about tyranny.
What does tyranny mean?
Tyranny is any time a government overreaches and they control a life too much.
Like slavery.
See, folks, this right here is the problem in America. There are those who have learned his story and those that have learned history. Too many of these guys running around here, and trust me, he is not the only person out there, and there are other people who wear blue suits and who wear power ties who believe the same thing, who espouse those views. The reality is the Civil War was about slavery. It wasn't about tyranny. And when they say states' rights, that was about slavery. This idiot should actually go read the actual secession statement of the state of South Carolina. It mentions slavery. If he goes back and reads the actual secession statement of Mississippi, he talks about slavery. That's what the Civil War was all about. There were white folks in the South who wanted to maintain the order of free labor. That's what it was about. There's no sense in us trying to have anything else. But also, if you're going to actually say the Civil War was about something else, at least learn to figure out a second answer. Otherwise, you look stupid. And that's why you are the Roland Martin Unfiltered, Stuck on Stupid Person of the Week. Folks, welcome back to Roland Martin Unfiltered. Louis Stokes was one of our great preeminent leaders who served in the United States Congress, co-founder of the Congressional Black Caucus. I had the opportunity to meet him. He was a huge fan of mine, and I was a fan of his as well. A pioneering figure in the state of Ohio. Well, he wrote a book before he died. It was published right before his death, and it was called The Gentleman from Ohio. Well, one of his children, Lori Stokes, a television anchor out of New York City, has taken upon herself to make sure that his story gets told and a whole new generation learns about her father. I caught up with her in New York City. Here's our conversation. All right, so let's talk about your father's book. It has to be, first of all, he finishes it and gets published, then he passes away. So now it's left to you to carry this thing over the goal line.
He finished it about 2 weeks before he passed. He found out 1 week before he passed that it was going to be published by Ohio State Press. And he passed away in August 18, 2015. And yes, then it was, for the most part, left up to me to deal with the publishers, to call all the photographs, of which some were at our home in Maryland and some at the home in Cleveland, filed for the most part. But they wanted photos that had never been seen before. Mm-hmm. And in our basement, in the area where the billiard room is, are just boxes and boxes of photos that are not categorized at all. But that's where I found the baby picture of him that had never been seen, the photo of him standing on the steps of the rickety old house on East 69th where they lived. And so I put all these photos together, put them in the trunk, brought them to Jersey where I live, and I set up my kitchen like a laboratory with lights everywhere, you know, and a magnifying glass, trying to find the photos that matched the manuscript. And it was a labor of love, intensive, very intensive.
But I mean, look, you lose a parent, and there's a natural grieving process for any son or daughter. But for you, this is a whole different deal because he wanted losing a father, but then all of a sudden, okay, I got to get this thing done.
And that's exactly what I felt. I could hear him saying, Lori, don't let me down. And I have a brother and I have two sisters, and you know, everyone played a role in some way. I was his primary caregiver the last 3 months of his life. So I knew the intensity of where things were going, and I knew that this was his dream to have this book published, the story of his life, which he never got around to until the last 5 years, and then really intensively for a year. And so I was fortunate where I was working at the time with WABC here in New York, that they allowed me to have the time that I had to take off. But once he was gone, and I knew I had this in my hands, I knew I had to get endorsements. So I reached out to Vernon Jordan and Nancy Pelosi, Robin Roberts, Charles Ogletree, so many people, Skip Gates, so many people that were so generous with their time and with their thoughts. That wasn't a problem. So I had them working on the endorsements. And then the rest was getting the photographs together, finding the cover. That was a whole nother situation. One that reflected both the politician and the lawyer and the thinker, which is what I thought I was able to find with the jacket to it. And I had a lot of help, between the publishers, also the co-writer, David Chanoff. I would send some of the photos to my siblings and say, what do you think of this one? It was just like my father led his life. Family, family, family. And once he left us with the magnificent story, the rest was really for us all to put together. I just knew I kind of had the final say.
Who titled the book?
Who titled it?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I'll tell you the story, which is very interesting, because it really was all of us. My father, I had found when I was cleaning out one of his offices at home, that he had the yellow legal size piece of paper that said, the Cardinal. It said, from poverty to the halls of Congress. And it had Mr. Chairman. And it said on the side, possible titles, something like that. So I knew that's what he kind of was thinking.
And the Cardinal, for folks who don't know, that's what they call the folks who are in the House Appropriations Committee, the folks who determine the money. So they're called the Cardinals.
Yes, when you get to that stature. And so, and he had great pride that this poor kid from Cleveland, Ohio, made it up the ranks to Cardinal. So that must have been in his mind. But when we started hashing out different titles, it was really collaborative with the siblings because everyone knew him in the halls of Congress on both sides of the aisle as the gentleman. He just had that reputation of working with both foes and allies, and in such a manner that everybody marveled at. So we had that. We knew he was a gentleman, and of course, the great state of Ohio. So it kind of came together, and we all just signed off and said, yeah, that's the one.
Was it also a learning process for you, because you're going through all of this stuff and, wow, man, ooh, I didn't know that, or, oh, I forgot about that. So, I mean, you're also going down memory lane, if you will, and as you begin to look at, all of these different photos and the relationships and all that sort of stuff like that.
There are a lot of tears along the way, a lot of warm feelings, chuckles, and sadness, because you keep thinking he should be here doing this. There was a lot that my siblings and my mom even, who helped him tremendously in writing the book, also sort of juggling his memory a little bit, jarring it and making sure she would say, no, Billy, that's not the way it happened. You remember, whatever. And he'd say, okay, Jay, you're right. But it was also, there are things in the book, what I was a little surprised about is sometimes he went there. Things that he would maybe talk about in private to us, or maybe had never even mentioned it, whether it was about Nixon and the days of starting with the Congressional Black Caucus, which he was a founder of, when they boycotted his State of the Union because he wouldn't address the issues that were going on with Black America and the constituencies that they had. Because Nixon wanted to cut funding to like the Job Corps, and that was something so near and dear to my dad. He talked about the benign neglect that Nixon ran his administration with. He talked about with Newt Gingrich and with the Republican Revolution, just about the hatred that was involved there. And he talked about in depth the racism that even when he got to the status of being a cardinal, he talks about he was with Senator Barbara Mikulski from Maryland, and they were going to meet Al Gore. And Barbara had gone through with her staff member through security, but when my father went through with his white driver, they got stopped. And they brought the dogs out, they ran the different, apparatus under the car, they told him to lift the trunk. And here he's thinking he's a United States congressman with seniority for years, and had to go through the indignity of that. And he says in the book, he says, you might be Lou Stokes, but you are still Lou Stokes, the black man. So there were, in that case, there were things that I was so glad he opened up about, and he went there and he said it. He talked about his meeting with Fidel Castro, and you know, because he was a trained lawyer, so he loved when he was chairing the House Select Committee on Assassinations for JFK and also for MLK, and he talked about that opportunity of going to Cuba to really interrogate Fidel Castro. So there were a lot of moments that I knew about growing up. I was 6 years old when he was elected to Congress. So there were many memories for me as the youngest kid going out there and door to door with the grassroots effort. But it was also just a loving memory of all of it. And then when you put together with the photographs, you really got a sense of what this man had lived through.
I ask all authors this, and I'll ask you this because even though you are not an author, you probably the closest to a co-author. A wow moment. There's always a wow moment when someone's doing the research. So when you had going through all of this, and what was that one when you went, wow?
I think leading up to, well, a couple. I think leading up to Terry versus Ohio, with him really breaking down, which we know today is stop and frisk. That was his case. You know, when he was a defense attorney and he represented a lot of criminals, both that were guilty and not, but his job was always to defend them. And he also had a close association with a lot of the underworld of Cleveland. And so when John Terry called him after being arrested with this charge, he just talked about how that for him was such a moment, because he used to hang out at the courthouse, you know, and waiting for cases to come. You know, he wasn't going to charge much money. And he talked about how even black folks who got into trouble didn't necessarily want a black lawyer representing them, right. You know. And so he just talked about, I never knew how much he just stood around the courtroom waiting for that moment. And of course, when John Terry got in trouble and he called one of the guys in the underworld and they said, call Lou Stokes, you know, he'll take care of you. The other thing, I always knew how close he was to my uncle Carl Stokes, who was America's first black mayor of a major U.S. city. And his baby brother was Carl. But he talked about them growing up so poor, how they would have to get, you know, through the Depression and having to go get beans and rice and, you know, just those staples, and that they would put them in a wagon and, you know, carry them to home, and that one of them had to hold a stick to fend off because everybody was poor and everybody was, you know, out there trying to get whatever they could. And I just marveled at how much time he spent establishing the relationship that he had with my Uncle Carl. I just saw so much symbolism in it, and how meaningful it was, and the fact that this is a man who grew up with no father. His father died when he was 3. But I have to say, he took so much time in the book also talking about family, myself, and my siblings, and what all that means, and of course his mother.
There was a recent documentary on Lorraine Hansberry, and I talked to the director of it, and she talked about, even in the documentary, all of these major figures that came through their home. When I was talking to Aretha Franklin, she was telling me this great story where someone, it was pretty laughable, where we were on the Selma red carpet, and one of the other journalists actually asked her thoughts about Dr. King and had she ever met Dr. King. And Aretha was real nice by saying, he stayed at our house. It's like, yeah.
Yes,
okay.
yes.
And so when you think back, I mean, being the daughter of the gentleman from Ohio, and who's who of Black America, they're coming through Cleveland. They're coming through your house.
Yes,
they're coming through. And so talk about just your experience of just being a child and just seeing, okay.
That it was normal.
Right.
It was normal. But you didn't realize that because it was your life. And the discussions that were going on. A revolution, changing the landscape of America and Black America.
Who's some of the people stand out? Some of the folks that stand out at you?
Well, when we think about, you mentioned MLK. When Martin Luther King was going across the country to galvanize people, to help them understand the right to vote and registering blacks all across the country, he spent a real significant time in Cleveland. I mean, that was a major driving force between being in our home, and also there were several nightclubs that, became the spot where people would gather, the movers and shakers, the politicians, clergy was so important as well. My father talks about the night that my Uncle Carl was elected to be Cleveland's mayor. And, the streets were going crazy, waiting for the numbers to come in. And there was this excitement in the air. And the numbers are tallied. He wins the election. They were all upstairs in headquarters. Martin Luther King, my dad, my uncle, Otis Moss, so many other notables. And when my Uncle Carl said, well, I need to go down, I need to talk to the people and thank them for what they've done, Martin Luther King told my uncle and my dad, Carl, you go on downstairs. I'm going to stay up here and stay with Lou. I don't want to take away anything from your moment. So my Uncle Carl went on downstairs, and I said to my father, I said, what did you all talk about? And he said, we just talked about how significant it was that we were being swept up in this moment, that it was a real time of change, and what was being done here in Cleveland would reverberate across America, that it would start something that this country had never seen before. I mean, so much of what really was the basis for the movement was really how significant the clergy was. My father was very steeped in faith. He wasn't the type of person who would beat you over the head with it, but that is what really grounded him, through his entire life. And so, you would have, of course, Jesse. Jesse was right there. In fact, I had Jesse on our show, Good Day, the other day, and he was recounting.
Now, see, everybody else would say, well, that's Reverend Jackson, but he was in y'all house so much. That's Jesse.
You're right. I should have said the Reverend
Jesse.
No, I'm just saying,
but that speaks to that relationship.
Yes, and it was. I mean, he was. They walked hand in hand the other day when I had him on, and he was telling me some stories. He's always telling me stories and he said, "No, you can't tell that," so I'm not going to tell that. But they knew that they were the key elements that would set the tone for generations to come. And you see, the warriors that continue to this day. Mm-hmm. Think of John Lewis, who is the only living member of those who were on the stage that day at the March on Washington. He was a kid back then, but he and my dad, of course, worked hand in hand on so much legislation as well. So it was a who's who, and but they were just people in the house, It was a special time, but you don't realize that until you really sit back. And when you flip through the pages of the book and you see the list of names and how things transpired, then it really hits you, like, wow,
Do you wish he had done this book years earlier?
Oh, my gosh, yes. We all do. But he was so busy. Everyone kept saying, Lou, you have to write this book, particularly when he was chairing the House Intelligence Committee, and when he was doing the House assassinations, and when he was on Iran-Contra, because America watched him dress down Oliver North and talk about how proudly he wore the uniform in a segregated army as much as proudly as Colonel North wore it. There were so many stories to tell, but when I asked him, Daddy, well, why didn't you write it sooner? And he said, because I didn't want people to think I thought I was a big deal. I didn't want my colleagues to say, man, Lou Stokes thinks he's something special. And so half of it was that, and the other half was he was always moving. He was always doing. You know, he died when he was 90 years old in August, and he was still giving speeches in April and in May. So up until the very end, he was still giving speeches until he was diagnosed with brain cancer. And then, you know, that was the only thing that stopped him. A couple of weeks before he passed away, and I was up at all different nights, you know, taking care of him. I could never sleep. He could never sleep. He was going through some, you know, tough times. And so I would go down and I'd sit by his bed and we'd have these wonderful conversations. And I would have a little piece of paper because I try to jot down, you know, things that he was saying. And so one day he said, you know, honey, I just never thought I would be in this situation. And he said, I was so busy living that I just didn't think about this. And, you know, I think that's why when you ask, you know, do we wish he wrote it earlier? Yes. Because instead of me going on the book tour he had that infectious laugh and smile and could hold such an audience and could tell you all the side stories. And so we're left with this beautiful story, which I think he was incredibly honest with. And there are actually some other stories of things he left behind that will also lend themselves to a couple of other books, things that have never been shown before. And that once this is, and it's in paperback now, once this has been sort of truly flushed out, I'm going to try and work on something else to keep the legacy going, even though he has so many things in place, you know, STEM programs across the country at our universities and at NIH, you know, building number 50, which is a Louis Stokes laboratory, at Howard's campus, the library, the Health and Science Library there, all across the country, Louis Stokes library wing in Cleveland. But man, he would have had a blast doing that.
All right, folks, that's it for Roland Martin Unfiltered. I've got to go, but I need y'all to do me a favor. I need you to share our show. Share this video. Tell everybody they should be watching Roland Martin Unfiltered every single day on Facebook, on YouTube, on Periscope, on Twitter. I also want you to contribute to our fan club, folks. We've got to fund our freedom. We've got to always be able to tell our story. Many other people out here, they're not going to be talking to Case Lawal, talking about black banks, or talking to Lori Stokes about her father, the late Congressman Louis Stokes. They're not going to be talking about, of course, showing that panel that took place. Those amazing folks on stage, Ben Jealous, Stacey Abrams, as well as Andrew Gillum. They're not going to be talking about any of these things. This is why we need our own media that we support, that we fund. So go to RolandMartinUnfiltered.com and please join our fan club, become one of our charter members. Folks, we've got some amazing things lined up. We want to have a powerful 2018 and then really hit it in 2019. And then when 2020 comes, and then, of course, when 2020 comes, we want to be the preeminent place talking about the presidential election. Again, go to RolandMartinUnfiltered.com to join our charter club today. I'll see you guys on Monday back in Washington, D.C. Take care. Holla!